At its peak, this company was worth $9 billion. Its founder was called the next Steve Jobs, gracing the covers of Forbes and Fortune. She had convinced a former Secretary of State, a former Secretary of Defense, and 2 former U.S. Senators to sit on her board. The company's entire product, a machine that could run hundreds of medical tests from a single drop of blood, barely worked at all. This is the story of Theranos, and the one decision made in a college dorm room that built a $9 billion fraud on a foundation that was never real to begin with. To understand how Theranos collapsed, you first have to understand the problem it claimed to solve, and why that problem made investors want so badly to believe. Traditional blood testing requires drawing multiple vials of blood, often from a needle in the arm, then sending samples to a lab that can take days to return results. It's uncomfortable, slow, and for anyone who needs frequent testing, cancer patients, the chronically ill, it's a genuine burden. In 2003, a 19-year-old Stanford chemical engineering student named Elizabeth Holmes dropped out of school with an idea to fix this. Her pitch: a machine small enough to sit on a countertop that could run over 200 different diagnostic tests using just a few drops of blood pricked from a fingertip. No needles, no labs. Results in minutes. It was an enormous claim, and almost nobody in the room asking her to prove it. Holmes founded her company, initially called Real-Time Cures and later renamed Theranos, and began raising money almost immediately. She was an extraordinarily effective pitch person, magnetic, intensely focused, and deliberate in the way she presented herself, reportedly adopting a distinctively low-speaking voice and modeling her uniform of black turtlenecks directly on Steve Jobs. The story worked. By 2004, Theranos had raised over $6 million. Over the following decade, that number would balloon to more than $700 million from investors, driven largely by Holmes's ability to project total, unshakable confidence in a technology that very few outsiders were ever allowed to actually examine. Holmes was remarkably selective about who got to see how the machine, internally nicknamed Edison, actually worked. Investors, journalists, and even most of Theranos' own employees only ever saw curated demonstrations. The company operated under an intense culture of secrecy. Employees worked in siloed departments, signed extraordinarily restrictive non-disclosure agreements, and were reportedly discouraged from asking questions about how other parts of the company functioned. By 2013, Theranos had partnered with Walgreens to roll out wellness centers in stores across Arizona and California, offering the public direct access to Theranos blood tests. By 2010, the company was valued at $9 billion, and Holmes, now worth an estimated $4.5 billion on paper, was being profiled as the youngest self-made female billionaire in the country, featured on the covers of Forbes, Fortune, and Inc. But that same culture of secrecy that had let Holmes build a $9 billion valuation without ever proving her technology actually worked was about to become the exact thing that exposed her. Inside Theranos, a small number of employees knew something the public didn't. The Edison machines frequently failed to produce accurate results. Internal engineers and scientists had raised concerns for years. The devices struggled with basic reliability, and for many of the tests being offered to real patients through Walgreens, Theranos was reportedly running samples on standard commercial lab equipment behind the scenes, not on its own technology, all while marketing the tests as powered by its revolutionary device. In 2014, a young Theranos employee named Tyler Shultz, grandson of board member and former Secretary of State George Shultz, began raising internal concerns about the accuracy of the company's testing. His concerns were largely dismissed inside the company. Around the same time, another lab employee, Erica Chung, was independently reaching similar conclusions about the reliability of the results being sent to real patients. Both eventually left the company and, in 2015, became key sources for Wall Street Journal investigative reporter John Carreyrou, who began digging into the gap between what Theranos claimed publicly and what was actually happening inside its labs. Here is the irony sitting at the center of this story. The same relentless secrecy that had let Holmes raise hundreds of millions of dollars without independent scientific verification, the trait that fueled the entire rise, was the very thing that meant almost no one inside the company had the full picture of how badly the technology was failing until it was too late to contain. In October 2015, the Wall Street Journal published Carreyrou's first exposé, revealing that Theranos was running the vast majority of its blood tests on traditional lab machines, not its own proprietary device, and that the Edison technology itself was unreliable, sometimes producing dangerously inaccurate results for real patients. The fallout was fast and severe. Regulators from the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services inspected Theranos' lab and found conditions posing what they described as immediate jeopardy to patient safety. In 2016, CMS revoked the company's license to operate as California Lab and banned Holmes from owning or operating a lab for 2 years. Walgreens terminated its partnership and closed all Theranos wellness centers. Theranos' valuation, once $9 billion, began an unstoppable slide toward zero. Lawsuits piled up from investors, from patients who'd received inaccurate results, and from business partners. In 2018, the Securities and Exchange Commission charged Holmes and Theranos' former president, Sunny Balwani, with what the agency called an elaborate, years-long fraud. That same year, facing criminal charges as well, Theranos formally dissolved. The criminal case took years to reach trial. In January 2022, following a lengthy federal trial, Elizabeth Holmes was convicted on 4 counts of investor fraud and conspiracy. In November 2022, she was sentenced to more than 11 years in federal prison. Theranos no longer exists in any form. The Edison device, the machine that was once supposed to revolutionize medicine, was never used again after the company's collapse, and its underlying technology was never independently validated as functional at the scale Holmes had claimed. Elizabeth Holmes began serving her federal prison sentence in 2023. Sunny Balwani was separately convicted on 12 counts of fraud and received a comparable sentence. Tyler Schultz and Erica Chung, the 2 whistleblowers whose internal concerns eventually reached John Carreyrou, both went on to work in healthcare and biotech accountability. Chung later founded a nonprofit focused specifically on supporting whistleblowers in science and medicine. Theranos' story isn't really about a broken blood testing machine. It's about what happens when total secrecy is mistaken for competitive advantage, when a culture built to hide the truth from outsiders ends up hiding the truth from the people inside the company too, until nobody has the full picture, until it's too late. It's a pattern that shows up again and again in business history. The very mechanism that fuels explosive growth is often the same one that guarantees nobody catches the problem in time. And it's exactly what happened, just a few years later, to a company that convinced the world it had reinvented an entire industry overnight, which is a story for another time. If you'd like to understand the hidden forces shaping our global economy, help us by subscribing to our channel.